My name is Jason, and today I will be reading my rendition of Chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby. A specter is haunting New York, the specter of love. It was painfully obvious that there was a fervent, uncontrollable, animal attraction between Nick Carraway and Mr. McKee. Despite only knowing each other for a few minutes after the party had started, I knew that Nick and Mr. McKee had to be together, and that it was up to me, Mary Sue, to set them up. And I had a plan as well. I would spike their drinks. Mr. and Mrs. McKee had arrived at the party alongside Mrs. Wilson's sister, Catherine. Meanwhile, Nick stared at an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen sitting on a blurred rock. He envied it. He envies how such a creature could accept a nice, thick, large cock or rooster. Yet Nick could not do the same. Nick's frustration permeated every conversation he had. "Nick, you need to do something about your wanting." "What?" he said. "No, I'm fine." "No! It's clear. It's very clear. You need to do the loving with them." Everyone else in the room nodded at this. "But what? Loving a married man? Isn't that wrong?" "Oh yeah, it's wrong. Very wrong. But just because something's wrong doesn't mean it shouldn't happen." "No," admitted Nick. "I suppose not." And he wandered off, presumably thinking about my suggestion. But soon more pressing matters arose. Tom had emerged from another room carrying a bottle of whiskey. I needed to get Nick and Mr. McKee drunk. Nick had sat down onto the couch and was sipping from his glass while reading Simon Called Peter. He and Mr. McKee seemed to be getting along quite nicely, which I attributed to the alcohol loosening them both up. The trouble now was keeping Mrs. McKee from interfering in nature's destiny. But it would seem that the women were already conversing amongst themselves, allocating time for nature to take its course. I began to pay attention to the woman. "She goes around looking at people's feet in their own homes," I heard Mrs. Wilson say. I stifled the chortle. "Is something funny, Mary?" asked Mrs. McKee. Nothing," I said quickly. "Feet," I said under my breath. The woman's droning was starting to bore me, and I started to drift off when suddenly something caught my attention. It was Mr. McKee. He was talking to Tom. "No!" I thought. "Tom doesn't need another lover." I strained my ears to listen to their conversation. And all I asked is that they should give me a start. To my relief, Tom had turned away from Mr. McKee, his bulging biceps flexing as he moved. Tom had lost interest in the conversation and had begun to talk to Myrtle about something regarding Mr. McKee's opportunities. Mr. McKee had retired to an armchair, slowly succumbing to fatigue. Meanwhile, Nick was chatting with Catherine, much to my dismay. But the very intrusive and exceedingly drunk Myrtle interrupted their conversation. "I almost made a mistake too," Mrs. McKee declared vigorously. "I almost married a Jew!" "At least you didn't marry a Jew," Mrs. Wilson retorted. This drew Catherine away from Nick. "Why did you, Myrtle?" demanded Catherine. "Nobody forced you to." I decided to add fuel to the fire. I too hate minorities. Tom slapped me on the back. "That's my boy." "Girl," I corrected him. "Whatever." I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit enough to lick my foot. I tried to suppress that mental image. I needed to stay calm. I withdrew to obtain more alcohol. While I was gone, I noticed that Nick was wiping a shaving cream stain off of Mr. McKee's face. I smiled. Now it was only a matter of time. When I got back, Mrs. McKee was gone, but trouble was brewing. Myrtle and Tom, fueled by whiskey, were beginning to become antagonistic. "Daisy! Daisy! Daisy!" shouted Mrs. Wilson. in a drunken stupor. Her annoyingly nasal voice was beginning to bother Tom. As Mrs. Wilson was showing no sign of stopping, Tom decided to take matters into his own hands. Quite literally. Tom raised his massive, thick, hard, throbbing hand. He spoke with a sort of rage only possible through ingestion of copious amounts of alcohol. With the roughness and barbarity of the colored races he so despised, Tom's voice rang out. Omaewa mo shinderu! And he struck down on Mrs. Wilson with the power and fury of a deity, breaking her nose. Mrs. Wilson let out a deafening moan. To the untrained ear, it would seem as if it was a scream of pain, but I knew better. It was a moan of pleasure. Evidently, Mrs. Wilson had experienced this kind of abuse regularly, and she thoroughly enjoyed it. Perhaps it was a fetish, but before I could assess the situation, we heard a loud thud emanating from the adjoining room. The room that contained Nick and Mr. McKee. We rushed over, knowing full well that if they did anything in that room, it would result in expensive damages. My suspicions proved prophetic, as we saw Nick on top of Mr. McKee, with a lustful gleam in both of their eyes. A thin piece of fabric was the only thing keeping Nick from Mr. McKee's bulging muscles. We had to get them out of there. We dragged Mr. McKee and Nick into the adjacent bedroom. We pushed Mr. McKee onto the bed, but we did not need to do the same for Nick. Nick leapt onto Mr. McKee with the strength and dexterity that could rival an Olympian long jumper. We hastily slammed the door shut, but it could barely contain the moans and screams emanating from the room. For hours, Nick and Mr. McKee would engage in wild, sloppy, gooey, fun, animalistic hand-holding. At that moment, special fun for the whole family times happened. A lot, at least 20 times of unabashed, ravenous, pleasureful hand-holding. Though the occasional scream would echo throughout the apartment, we all politely ignored it. All night long, we heard the moans. A single tear rolled down my cheek. I had created true love. But this was not to last. Once the sun rose up, Mrs. McKee came back to the apartment, demanding her husband's whereabouts. We tried our best to contain her, but she knocked down the bedroom door, revealing that Nick and McKee were in the middle of their love fest. Enraged, she tore the two lovers away from each other, much to their dismay. "I don't want to go!" exclaimed Mr. McKee. But his cries were not addressed. Nick tried to reassure his lover. "I'm coming," said Nick. "I'm coming for you, my love." Oh! But alas, this was a lie. There was nothing Nick could do. But still, Mr. McKee was silenced, for he knew that in time, he and Nick would once again be together. The end. Thank you for listening to this audio recording. For more free audiobooks like this, please visit www.iwanttodie.com.